Welcome to the Sleep Charming podcast, the podcast where I help you drift off for a good night's sleep or simply take a moment to relax. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave a review or a rating. So sit back, take a deep breath, and let me read you an old story. No one can speak with exactness as to the time when sculpture was first practiced by the Egyptians. We only know that it was a very long time ago. But we do know that in the time of the 12th dynasty, which dates from 2466 BC, sculpture had reached a stage of excellence such as could only have resulted from the experience of many years of training and practice in this art. In the Egyptian collection of the Louvre at Paris, there is a memorial stone of an old Egyptian sculptor, which has an inscription that reads as if he had written it himself. This was the way by which Egyptians made these inscriptions sound as if the dead themselves spoke to those who were alive. The sculptor's name was Martensen, and he lived about 44 centuries ago. Brooks Bay, a very learned writer on Egypt, says, he calls himself a master among those who understand art, and a plastic artist, who was a wise artist in his art. He relates in succession his knowledge in the making of statues, in every position, according to prescribed use and measure, and brings forward, as his particular invention, an etching with colours, if I have rightly understood the expression, which can neither be injured by fire nor washed off by water, and as a further explanation of this, states that no man has arisen who has been able to do this except himself alone, and the eldest son of his race, whom God's will has created. He has arisen able to do this, and the exercise of his hand has been admired in masterly works in all sorts of precious stones, from gold and silver to ivory and ebony. There is no doubt but that Martensen and his son, who is named Ertesen, were sculptors of the time when Egyptian art reached its highest point. The earliest works of Egyptian sculpture are the bas-reliefs found in the chamber of the tombs. The walls are almost covered with them, and they are painted with colours, which are still bright and fresh, though more than 4,000 years have passed by since they were put on. The subject of these reliefs are taken from the life of the persons buried in the tomb, and even their possessions and occupations are thus represented. These sculptures were made by tracing the designs on the stone and then cutting it away between the figures. The mode of arrangement in these reliefs does not satisfy our ideas of what it should be. It seems as if the artist had no plan of their work in their minds, no aim as to what the effect should be when finished. On the contrary, the reliefs impress us as if the sculptors made one figure and then added another and another in such a way as to represent the fact they wished to tell without any attention to the beauty of the whole, and so it does not seem as if there was any unity in them, but as if the large bas-reliefs were made up of disjointed parts which in one sense really have no relation to each other. The same is true of the Egyptian statues. It appears as if the different parts might have been made separately, or even by different sculptors, and then joined together. All this is because the Egyptians seem to think of an object in parts and not as a whole. Then too, the position of the early statues was so unnatural and awkward. The arms are placed close to the sides of the body, and there was no separation between the legs, and though in some of their articles of furniture, their pottery, and in the details of their architecture, the Egyptians made a great advance. they did not equally improve in their sculpture. One great hindrance to the progress of Egyptian sculpture was the fact that figures were never represented in action. They were not figures moving and living in stone. They were like figures petrified and fixed. They were statues, and no one can forget this for a moment while looking at them. I can learn of but one Egyptian figure sculpted as if in action. This is a quoit thrower in the tombs of the kings. A sitting statue, whether of a man or a woman, had the hands rested on the knees or held across the breast. There were only very few groups of Egyptian sculpture, and these seldom had more than 2 figures. It was customary to represent a husband and a wife, sitting on the same chair, holding each other's hands, or having their arms around one another's waist or shoulders. Sometimes the principal figure is of a large size, and the inferior persons are made much smaller and placed at the sides of the larger figure. In short, very few attitudes are represented in Egyptian sculpture, and it almost seems as if there must have been fixed rules for a certain limited number of positions after which all sculptured figures were made. In spite of this sameness and stiffness, Egyptian sculpture is remarkable, and it is probable that if they had not been fettered by prejudices and rules, the Egyptians would have excelled both in sculpture and painting. The sides of obelisks, and more especially the walls of temples, were covered with sculptures which gave the history of kings, of their wars and conquests, and of their great work in their kingdoms. The sculptures upon the temple walls could be estimated by square rods, or even acres, by better than lesser measures. Their amount and the labor required to make them are simply marvelous. I will describe the subjects depicted upon one inner wall in the palace temple of Medmet Habu, and will quote from Wilkinson's Egypts and Thebes. On the west wall, the Egyptian princes and generals conduct the captive chiefs into the presence of the king. He is seated at the back of his car, and the spirited horses are held by his attendants on foot. Large heaps of hands are placed before him, which an officer counts one by one, as the other notes down the number on a scroll, each heap containing 3,000, and the total indicating the return of the enemies slain. The number of captives, reckoned 1,000 in each line, is also mentioned in the hieroglyphs above, where the name of the Rebbe points out the nation against whom this war was carried on. Their flowing dresses, striped horizontally with blue or green bands on a white ground, and their long hair and aquiline noses give them the character of an eastern nation in the vicinity of Assyria and Persia. As their name reminds us of the Rabbi of Ptolemy, whom he places near the Caspian. The suite of this historical subject continues on the south wall. The king, returning victorious to Egypt, proceeds slowly in his car, conducting in triumph the prisoners he has made, who walk beside and before it, 3 others being bound to the ankle. 2 of his sons attend as fan-bearers, and the several regiments of Egyptian infantry were the corps of their allies under the command of these princes, marching in regular step and in the close array of disciplined troops, accompany their king. He arrives at Thebes and presents his captives to Amun-Ra and Mut, the deities of the city, who compliment him, as usual, on the victory he has gained, and the overthrow of the enemy he he has trampled beneath his feet. The description of these bas-reliefs, which are usually painted, will give an idea of the great works of Egyptian sculptures. The representation of the animals in these sculptures is as successful as any part of them. There being no intellectual expression required, they are more pleasing than the human beings, with their set, unchanging features and expression. The Egyptians had several breeds of dog. One of the figures, often repeated by the sculptures of Egypt, was the Sphinx. The colossal and most famous one is not far from the Great Pyramid, and has the form of a recumbent lion with a human head. It is 172 feet long, and is the Sphinx of the world. But there were great numbers of these strange figures in Egypt. In some cases, they were avenues leading to the temples bordered by them on each side. The form of the Sphinx was intended to express some spiritual thought to the Egyptians, and the stories about it are very interesting. Its form certainly denotes the union of physical and mental power. The form of which we have spoken as being that of the Great Sphinx is called the Androsphinx. Another has the body of the lion with the head of the ram, and is called Cryosphinx. Still another has the same body and the head of a hawk. This is called Hierarchosphinx. They all typified the king without doubt, and it is probable that the various heads were so given to show respect for the different gods who were represented with the heads of these creatures. Sometimes the Androsphinx has human hands in place of the lion paws. The winged sphinx has been found in Egypt but is rare. The colossal statues of Egypt are very wonderful on their account of their vast weight and size. The most famous are two which stand on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes. Each of these colossi is made from a single block of stone, such as is not found within several days' journey of the place where they stand. They are 47 feet high and contain 11,500 cubic feet each. But a third is still larger. It represents the king Ramesses II, and when whole was a single stone, and weighed 887 tons. It was brought from Aswan to Thebes, a distance of 138 miles. It is wonderful to think of moving such a vast weight over such a distance, and one would naturally wish to know also how the sculptors could work on such a statue. I've now pointed out the marked peculiarities of Egyptian sculpture, and before leaving the subject, will call your attention to the fact that in most cases it was used in connection with and almost as a part of Egyptian architecture. In the tombs, the bas-reliefs are for the decoration of the walls and to finish the work of the architect, while at the same time they are an interesting feature of the art of the nation and period. In the temple places, this is also true, though the reliefs serve the purpose of telling the history of the kings. They are, as it were, framed into and make a part of the architectural effect. The obelisks, colossal figures, and sphinxes were placed before the grand buildings, and made a part of them architecturally. In general terms, we may say that sculpture never became an independent art in Egypt, but was essentially wedded to architecture. And this fact largely accounts for that other truth that sculpture never reached the perfection in Egypt that it promised, or the excellence that would have seemed to be the natural result of its earliest attainments. The works of sculpture in Assyria consisted of statues, bas-reliefs, statuettes in clay, carvings in ivory, metal castings, and some smaller works, such as articles for jewelry, made in minute imitation of larger works in sculpture. The statues found in Assyria are by no means beautiful, according to our idea of beauty. They are as set and stiff in design as the Egyptian works of this sort, and they have suffered so much injury from the weather and from violence that we cannot judge of the manner in which they were originally finished. The number of Assyrian statues that have been found is small. Sardanapalus I is in the best state of preservation of any of them. It is smaller than life-size, being about 42 inches high. The statuettes of the Assyrians are less artistic than the statues. They are made from clay which turned red in baking and are coloured so as to resemble Greek pottery. They are almost always in a grotesque appearance and usually represent gods or genii. They also combine human and animal forms in a less noble and artistic way than is done in the Egyptian representation of the Sphinx. There are also small figures of animals in terracotta, principally dogs and ducks. But the large and small statues of the Assyrians are their most unimportant works in sculpture. It is in their bas-reliefs that their greatest excellence is seen, and in them alone their progress in art can be traced. This sort of sculpture seems to have been used by the Assyrians just as painting was used in Italy after the Renaissance. It was their mode of expressing everything. Through it, they gave expression to their religious feeling. They told the history of their nation and glorified their kings. They represented the domestic scenes which now make the subjects of genre pictures, and even imitated vegetables and fruits, as well as to reproduce landscapes and architecture in these pictures cut from stone. In truth, it is chiefly from the bas-reliefs that we learn the history of Assyria. And in this view, their sculptures are even more important than when they are considered merely from an artistic view. The most ancient places at Nimrud furnish the earliest examples of bas-reliefs. These date at about the end of the 10th century BC. One striking peculiarity in the design is that all the figures, both men and animals, are given an exact profile. In spite of the sameness of position, they have much spirit and action. The picture of a lion hunt is one of the very best of these reliefs. And you will notice that the animal forms are much superior to those of the human beings. This is true of all Assyrian art in all its stages. In these oldest bas-reliefs, there are no backgrounds, but later on these are added, and mountains, hills, streams, trees, and wild animals are all introduced as detail of the general design. The highest state of this art was reached about 650 BC. At this period, the various forms seem to be more varied and less arranged according to some rule. The human faces and figures are more delicately finished, and there is an air of freedom and a spirit in the handling of the subjects that is far better than that of any other time. the plants and trees are far more beautiful than before. The figures of animals, too, are full of life and action in this period. I shall only give one illustration, and shall choose the head of a lion, probably the best specimen of animal drawing which is yet known in Assyrian art. It represents the head of a wounded lion who is in his agony, rushes up on a chariot and seizes the wheel with his teeth. The drawing of this head, as a portrayal of agony and fierceness, compares favorably with anything of the same kind belonging to any age of art, either classic or modern. There is a question which has not yet been decided as to the amount of colour used on the Assyrian bas-reliefs. From the traces of colour remaining on those that are found in excavations, and from what we know of the use of colours on the buildings to which the bas-reliefs belonged, we may be sure that colours were used on them, but to what extent cannot be told. It may have been applied with the freedom of the Egyptians, or it may have been sparingly used, as was the manner of the ancient Greeks. The colours that have been found in the ruins of Assyria are white, black, red, and blue. Next to the sculpture, the metal work of the Assyrians was the most important of their arts. This was done in 3 ways. Whole figures or parts of figures cast in a solid shape, castings of low bas-reliefs, embossed designs made chiefly with the hammer, but finished with the graver. In the solid castings, there are only animal forms, and lions are far more numerous than any other creature. Many of them have a ring fastened to their back, which indicates that they were used for weights. These castings are all small and their form good, but we have no reason to think that the Assyrians could make large metal castings. The castings in relief were used to ornament thrones, furniture, and perhaps chariots. They were fastened in their places by means of small nails. They had no great merit. The embossed or hammered work, on the contrary, is artistic and very curious. Large numbers of embossed bowls and dishes have been found, and this work was used for the end of sword sheaths, the sides of chairs and stools, and various other ornamental purposes. It is probable that the main part of the tables, chairs, and so were of wood, with ornaments in embossed metals. All this shows the Assyrians to have been an artistic people, and to have reached an interesting stage in their arts. Though their works are coarse and imperfect when judged by Greek standards or by our own idea of what is beautiful, if we had the space to consider all the various designs of the bas-reliefs in detail, you would learn from them a great many interesting facts concerning the domestic life of this ancient and interesting people. From them, we can learn all about the costumes worn by the king and those of lesser rank, can see how their wars were carried on, and what their chariots, weapons, and equipments were, their games, amusements, musical instruments, agricultural pursuits, food, and in short, everything connected with their daily life is plainly shown in these sculptures. And as I have said before, the whole history of Assyria is better studied from them than from any other one source. For this reason, their great value cannot be overestimated. Other very ancient nations had sculptors, and a few remains of their art still exist. This is true of the Medes, Babylonians, and Persians, but the general features of their arts resembled those of the Assyrians, though they were less advanced than that nation and have left nothing as interesting as the Egyptian and Assyrian remains which we have considered, I shall therefore leave them and pass to the sculpture of Greece. We have seen that the Egyptians and Assyrians were skillful in sculpture, but at the same time, their works have not moved us as we wish to be moved by art. There is always something beyond them to be desired, and it remains for the Greeks to attain that perfection in sculpture which satisfies all our nature and fills our highest conceptions of beauty and grace. In truth, in Greece alone has this perfection in plastic art existed, and since the time of its highest excellence, then no other nation has equaled the examples of Greek sculpture which still exist. Though we have reason to believe that the finest works have perished, and that those remaining are of the second grade. There are many reasons for the high artistic attainments of the Greeks, and a discussion or even a simple statement of them would require an essay far too learned and lengthy for the scope of this book. But I will speak of one truth that has great influence and went far to perfect Greek art. That is, the unbounded love of beauty, which was an essential part of the Greek nature. To the Greek, in fact, beauty and good had the same meaning. Beauty was good, and the good must be beautiful. Sculpture deals almost exclusively with the form of man, and the other features in it have some relation to the human element of the design. And it would have been impossible for a true Greek to represent the human form otherwise than beautiful. A writer on this point says, "The chief aim of the enlightened Greek, his highest ambition and his greatest joy, was to be a man in the fullest sense of the word, man in the most complete development of his bodily strength and beauty, in the active exercise of the keenest senses, in the greatest because tempered enjoyment of sensual pleasure, in the free and joyous play of an intellect strong by nature, graced and guided by the most exquisite taste, and enlightened by the sublimest philosophy." Thus beauty was so important to the Greek that every parent prayed that his children might have this gift, and the names of beautiful persons were engraved upon pillars set where all could read them. And at times there were competitions for the prize of beauty. The religion of the Greek, too, taught that the body was the beautiful and godlike temple of his soul, and the truth that human beings have something in common with a higher power than their own gave him a great respect for humanity. And in truth, he felt that if he could escape death, he should be content and almost, if not quite, a god. For we must remember that the gods of Greek were not all wise, all powerful, and all good, as we believe our God to be. If you read their mythology, you will find that with great power of the god, much imperfection and weakness were mingled. They did not believe that Zeus had been the greatest god from the beginning, but that there was a time when he had no power. He was not omniscient nor omnipresent, and was himself subject to the decrees of fate. As when he could not save his love Sarpedon from death, not knowing all things, even the gods are sometimes represented as depending upon mortals for information. And all these religious views tend to make the human form far more noble to the Greek than it can be to the Christian, with his different views of the relations of God and man. Greek sculpture existed in very early days. and we have vague accounts of a person called Daedalus who seems to have been a woodcarver. Many cities claim to have been his birthplace, and no one can give any clear account of this ancient artist. He is called the inventor of the axe, saw, gimlet, plummet line, and a kind of fish glue or isinglass. He is also said to have been the first sculptor who separated the arms from the bodies of his statues or made the feet to step out. He also opened their eyes, and there is a legend that the statues of Daedalus were so full of life that they were chained lest they should run away. We call the time to which Daedalus belonged the prehistoric period, and his work and those of other artists of his day have all perished. Two very ancient specimens of sculpture remain: the Lion Gate of Mycenae and the Niobe of Mount Sipylus. But as their origin is not known, and they may not be the work of Greek artists, it is best for us to pass on to about 700 BC, when the records of individual artists begin. Among the earliest of these was Diphitades, of whom Pliny said that he was the first who made likeness in clay. This author also adds that Diphitades first mixed red earth with clay, and made the masks which were fastened to the end of the lowest hollow tiles on the roofs of temples. Pliny relates the following story of the making of the first portrait in bas relief. Diphitades lived in Sicyon and had a daughter called sometimes Cora. She could not aid her father very much in his work as a sculptor, but she went each day to the flower market and brought home flowers, which gave a very gay and cheerful air to her father's little shop. Cora was very beautiful, and many young Greeks visited her father for the sake of seeing the daughter. At length, one of these youths asked Diphitades to take him as an apprentice, and when his request was granted, the young man made one of the family of the sculptor. Their life was one of simple content. The young man could play upon the reed, and his education fitted him to be the instructor of Cora. After a time, for some reason that Pliny does not mention, it was best for the youth to go away from the artist's home, and he then asked Cora if she would be his wife. She consented, and vows of betrothal were exchanged, while they were sad at the thought of parting. The last evening of his stay, as they sat together, Cora seized a coal from the brazier and traced upon the wall the outline of the face that was so dear to her, and she did this so correctly that when her father saw it, he knew instantly from what face it had been drawn. Then he wished to do his part, for he also loved the young man. So he brought his clay and filled the outline which Cora had drawn, and so went on to model the first portrait in bas relief that was ever made. Thus did this great art grow out of the love of this beautiful maiden of Sicyon about 2,500 years ago. After this beginning, Diphitades went on to perfect his art. He made medallions and busts, and decorated the beautiful Grecian structures with his work. And work in bas relief became the most beautiful ornamentation of the splendid temples and theatres of Greece. He also founded a school for modelling at Sicyon, and became so famous an artist that several Greek cities claim the honour of having been his birthplace. The bas relief made from Cora's outline was preserved in the Nymphaeum at Corinth for almost 200 years, but was then destroyed by fire. She married her lover, and he became a famous artist at Corinth.